So, hey Liz, why do you hate men?
I don't. Why? Do you hate men?
I don't hate men.
I do know that people on the internet keep telling me that feminists hate men, so.
Here's the thing. We're both married to men. We work with men. We're friends with men. We're both about to become mothers to sons. We don't hate men.
Some of our best allies and friends and supporters are men.
Yeah, so why do people always seem to assume that feminists hate men then?
One of the most persistent myths in the anti-feminist canon is that feminism is a movement devoted to despising or disempowering men, rather than one devoted to empowering women and promoting equal rights and opportunities regardless of sex. I'm not sure where this idea that feminists hate men began. Some of the earliest US feminist movements were both full of men themselves, and the women that were, behind them were mostly married to men and in seemingly happy relationships with them. At the same time, some of the earliest anti-feminist memes revolved around this idea that feminists were man-haters who were either spinsters or married to these pathetic browbeat husbands.
Yeah, I actually love a lot of those memes, and it's funny how much those attitudes that you see in those memes are like the same as the memes you see nowadays, even though they're over 100 years old. There's a lot of cats, for one.
Funny and sad, yeah, and there's a lot of cats. Cats have made the internet go round communications go round since long before the internet.
But anyway, I think there's a combo effect here, right? Like, there's some misogynists who view any attempt at equality as inherently hostile to men. Then there are also those who, whether they believe it or not, find it a really useful talking point to say that feminists and women hate men. It's also a messaging problem. So a lot of the concepts that are talked about by feminists can be easily misinterpreted, and often are, sometimes innocently, sometimes deliberately, as statements of either aggression or hostility against men. For example, when feminists talk about toxic masculinity, they're speaking about a specific set of negative traits that are different and separate from masculinity as a whole, which can be positive or negative or, well, neutral. But what a lot of people end up hearing and what they think feminists are saying is that masculinity, just plain old masculinity, all masculinity is bad, and that feminists hate masculine traits. There's also the issue that when society is always by default revolved around your needs and interests, when you've essentially been the norm or the default for most of history, any step towards actual equality can really feel like an attack on you. Take the anger around the characters in the more recent Star Wars films, for example. For the vast majority of Star Wars tenure in pop culture, it was really a movie about, well, white guys, right? Sure, you had Princess Leia and you had Lando Calrissian, and then like a few decades later, you got Princess Amidala, but like now all of a sudden you have Finn and Rose and Rey, and while the vast majority of humans in the Star Wars universe are still, well, white and male, those characters stick out because they're not. And for the first time, a lot of people are being asked to empathize with characters who don't look like them. For women and people of color, that's nothing new. Again, in the entire original series, we only get to see one woman and one black man in key roles, really. But when every protagonist has pretty much been a white male, when you have a protagonist who isn't, you notice, and it can feel like something's really being taken from you.
So you kind of lost me at some of the Star Wars stuff, but I think that I agree with you about your diagnosis of how misunderstandings of what feminists are saying often contribute to this idea that feminists hate men. We should probably also add, though, that, some feminists really do hate men, or if not necessarily hate, at least have some pretty strongly negative and frankly sexist ideas about them. I think this is and always has been a minority among feminists, but it's also a very vocal minority and one that gets outsized attention from the media and from people who oppose women's rights issues, because these sorts of feminists make much more effective PR against feminism than, say, feminists like us do. So this isn't to deny that some man-hating feminists have existed or that some still do today. But there's a lot of language that feminists use about men to make a point or to vent frustration. I'm thinking the whole men are trash meme that became big controversy a few years back. And people, willfully or not, misinterpret this, when most of the people posting or commenting men are trash are doing so hyperbolically, in the same way you might be like, cilantro is literally the worst, or fuck my life, or whatever.
Yeah, so there's this great story from the early days of punk, because I was talking about Star Wars, now I'm going to talk about punk music.
That's better, that's much better.
So Richard Hell of the band Television makes this t-shirt, right? And it's got a target painted on it, and it says, "Please kill me." And he gives it to his bandmate, Richard Lloyd. Yes, that is two Richards in one band. So he gives it to Richard Lloyd to wear, and Richard Lloyd wears this t-shirt to a gig that they're playing at one of the early punk clubs. And after the show, these two kids come up and they're like really wild-eyed and they're huge fans, right? And so they come up to Richard Lloyd and they say, like, are you serious? Like, can we be the ones to kill you to prove that we're your biggest fans? And this totally freaked him out, because, like, how would that not freak you out, right? Because he thought it was so obviously like tongue-in-cheek, like a joke, just like the whole punk ethos. And here were these kids actually offering to kill him because they assumed that that's what he wanted. And needless to say, he never wore the shirt again.
That sounds like a good choice.
Yeah, actually, strangely enough, you can actually now buy this shirt online. It's mass produced and everything, which I think tells you something about the fact that, like, humor over time, it changes and people start to understand that it's a joke, right? But humor aside, putting that to the side there, I digressed a little bit. A lot of people are also speaking from a place of trauma. They've had these really bad negative experiences with certain terrible men, rape, domestic violence, stalking, things like that. And they're still processing and dealing with those. And, objectively, they more or less understand that not all men are rapists and abusers. And in fact, most aren't. But they don't really have a really clear, easy, reliable way for determining which men they don't know that well are a threat and which ones aren't. And that's often compounded by the sorts of attitudes you hear from people about things like, well, you should have known that he was dangerous, or, well, it's your fault that the man you married turned out to be an abuser.
Right. And of course, it's not just feminists who, make these sort of blanket statements about men that are perhaps unfair and sort of judge all men based on experiences or stories about, a few. Obviously, a lot of men and women, not necessarily feminists either, they don't hate the opposite sex, but they do have a lot of sexist opinions about them. Like, all women are liars or hysterical, or all men have uncontrollable sexual urges or can't help being physically violent. I mean, there's so many things like that. Boys will be boys, I think you're actually much less likely to hear that sort of gendered thing coming from feminists in general.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of those ideas, a lot of that stuff is really very mainstream. And it's also a lot more hateful than anything that you'd hear from your average feminist. Because feminists don't think that men are inherently stupid or violent or evil, dangerous. We believe that some men can be, just as some women or non-binary people can be. But in actuality, we hold everybody up to a higher standard, men, women, whatever, because we truly believe that most men and women and everyone else are, well, good people who want to do good things, and they aren't these horrible, characterizations that you hear about.
Like TV sitcom dads.
Yes.
When this was a big discussion, they're just like always doofuses and bumbling and incompetent and constantly failing their wives and their children. And that all gets, played for comedic effect. That's not feminists who are making these sitcoms. Like, we weren't the ones making Everybody Loves Raymond or The Simpsons. Sitcoms are arguably some of the most mainstream and least woke forms of entertainment out there.
Exactly. And there's just a lot of hatefulness about men and women built into our pop culture and just accepted all the time. And it's actually feminists, including feminist men, who are the ones who are most likely to challenge these things.
So that brings us to another good question, or at least a question we hear a lot. Can men be feminists?
Yes, they can. Men can be feminists, and well, they need to be feminists. If only, say, women care about gender equality, well, then it's never going to happen. The idea that people are individuals who deserve the same rights and have more or less the same basic needs and wants and desires and feelings, though they may individually vary on how they express those or how they want to acknowledge those, that needs to be something that everyone more or less generally accepts for it to work. And, I really think we're getting there. I think most people nowadays really do believe that women should be able to own property or decide who they want to marry or work in whatever career they prefer. And of course, there's a lot of places where the genders are still unequal, but that's often because we're relying on these old cultural norms and attitudes and stuff like that. But those discussions are still happening and things are changing, and they have a lot even within our own lifetimes. There's also the fact that sexist men who really do believe that women are inferior to them, are not going to listen to women. They need to hear these ideas coming from men that they trust and respect. They need to have the men in their own social circles calling them out or, calling them in when they say or do something sexist, or just tell them, hey man, that's not cool. There's also some not so nice men out there who use the language or the ideas of feminism to excuse their bad behavior, who think that feminism is this easy tool for them to manipulate some more naive women to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. And I think there's also a lot of good men who worry that if they call themselves feminists, people will perceive them that way, that they'll think that they're one of these creeps. But overall, I think that's actually really rare. Most people are decent people. Most men are decent people. And for the most part, most people really do believe in the concept of equality, even if they sometimes fall back on less than equal norms and customs that they just really haven't thought about.
That's all a really good analysis. I'll just add that, yes, in my opinion, men can totally be feminists. I can understand, though, why some men who are very feminist in their principles and in their thinking might feel uncomfortable saying so and prefer to say that they're feminist allies or egalitarians or something like that. I don't much care one way or the other, to be honest. It's one of those debates that comes up every few years, and I wish it would stop. It's boring and unproductive, I think. I don't care what feminist-minded men or anyone calls themselves. I care more about what they do. But, we've talked about this before in terms of gender and in terms of, it comes up in terms of things like sexuality and politics and religion and all sorts of things. People are sort of obsessed with labels and who gets to rightfully use them. And some movements and feminist movements and groups can get really hung up on that. And I think that just distracts us from, more important work.
Yeah, so that actually reminds me of something else we've discussed with feminist labeling, the shifting goalposts. So you'll have people who say things like, how can anyone not consider themselves a feminist? Feminism just means that women should have rights, or feminism just means caring about equality.
Or my favorite, feminism is just the radical notion that women are people.
Right. So then a lot of people say that, like, okay, then yeah, I'm a feminist. If that's the definition, if it just means that I believe that women can be equal to men, then sure, I'm a feminist. And then once they do, the same women's rights groups or segments of feminists will come right back at them and say things like, okay, but if you don't support Joe Biden's free, note the scare quotes around that, free childcare plans, then you're not really a feminist. Or if you don't support whatever Hillary Clinton is saying about this issue, or Kamala Harris is saying about this issue, or whatever some other Democratic woman does, you're not really a feminist. Or how can you call yourself a feminist and not be for gun control? Or if you were really a feminist, you would be anti-capitalism, or you would vote blue, or you would whatever, right? Ugh.
Yeah, it's a bait and switch. It starts with this broad definition so that it's like, how could you not call yourself a feminist? Only the biggest Neanderthals and, misogynists or, terrible people would say that they're not feminist. But then if you say you are a feminist and you're not the right kind of person, you'll be, hear that, like, actually you can't be a feminist because, it's these people trying to define feminism as essentially whatever Democrats or progressives want at the time, or whatever is popular for them at the time. Anyway, we like to say that, libertarian feminism is the radical notion that women and men and everybody they're all individuals and should be treated like individuals.
Right. And we do that. And then people are like, okay, so then why are you calling yourself a feminist? Why don't you just call yourself an egalitarian then?
Yeah, this is another big criticism that we always get, or at least, a big comment that we always get is, why if feminism is all about equality and it's not just about women and female supremacy, then why don't you call it egalitarianism instead? Or why don't you call it humanism instead? Which, that's a whole other movement. So no, but.
Right. So they argue that because feminism has that femme root in it, that it necessarily has to be only about and for women. And then sometimes they go on to say that feminism is actually about female supremacy or something similar to that, which is either just really ignorant or really disingenuous, in my opinion.
Right? Feminism is called feminism because for the vast, expanse of history, both laws and culture overwhelmingly benefited men over women. And women were legally barred from owning property and making their own reproductive sexual decisions, making their own economic decisions and things like that. So the road to equality necessarily needed to focus on women and women's rights because there were clear short-term gains to be made toward equality.
Right. And now we're at a point that it's no longer just about women's rights we're focused on. There's many specific issues that we care about might actually relate more to the rights of men or to trans people or non-binary people. But the general principle and goals of the movement haven't changed. So it really just doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of time and energy totally rebranding the movement, especially when the main reason why we would do so is just because some people are just really uncomfortable thinking about the extent to which women specifically really just weren't and haven't been given equal rights for much of human history.
There's also the fact that people are already using the term feminism. So it means something, it has a following and people care about it. It's a branding thing.
Yeah, and if we just refuse to engage with those people, if we decide we're not going to talk about feminism, we're not going to call ourselves feminists, we're not going to, anything that has feminism in it, we just won't talk about or read or go to those conferences or whatever. People aren't just going to suddenly stop becoming feminists and decide that they're now egalitarians or whatever, right? Instead, they're just not going to listen to anything that we have to say. And they'll probably, possibly, rightfully assume that we're not actually on their side and that we don't share any common ground with them, when really we do.
I think it's fair to say that feminism is obviously concerned with women's rights still, but it's also become a movement, and especially libertarian feminism is a movement that's more about, equality before the law and, striking down gender stereotypes and gendered expectations and things like that. And that is definitely something that doesn't just benefit women.
Yes, feminism is good for women, but feminism is good for men too. Feminism is good for everyone.
So I hope all the dudes out there watching this understand by now that first, guys, we don't hate you, really. And second, we, Kat and I and a whole bunch of other feminists, we actually want to help you because we think feminism is at its core about bolstering the ability for everyone, regardless of sex, to have the most full choices and live their best lives. And no matter what chromosomes or genitalia you have, it's hard to live your best life and your most free life if people insist in putting you in some sort of box.
Yeah, there's really nothing more collectivist than simply treating people as a representative of their sex or their gender. And that is exactly what anti-feminism does. Anti-feminism says people are not individuals who have their own unique mix of traits and talents and wants and goals and desires, but rather that they are, or at least that they should be, a certain way based entirely on their sex.
This is very bad for women, but it's also very bad for men too.
Yeah, a lot of the things that feminists have historically been fighting against, those things we might call, the patriarchy, puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on boys and men as well, not just on women. Those are things like expectations that men will always be strong, that they'll always be brave, that men will always be the breadwinner.
That they'll always make the first move in romance or sex.
that men shouldn't cry and that they can't be interested in certain things like, I don't know, dancing or cooking or looking nice in their clothes.
I saw someone say the other day, like, I wonder if Gen Z knows that we used to about metrosexuals, that we used to have a whole separate term for men who can groom themselves.
Right.
Yeah, like, yeah, that's kind of another stereotype that only men who were gay cared about grooming, or if they did, it was so novel that they needed like their own separate term, so yeah, that's one. I was also going to say, this idea that men aren't good at parenting.
Yeah, that men who work in childcare must be pedophiles or creeps of some sort. That, men and boys always want sex from whomever is offering it, unless, of course, it's a man, eye roll. And that men can't be raped, or, that they can't just not be in the mood sometimes.
All of these assumptions can lead to bad situations for women, preventing them from reaching their full potential and putting them in danger, but they can also be really damaging for men too.
Yeah. So when Liz and I were younger, there was books like Men Are From Mars and Women From Venus and The Rules, which were bestsellers that shaped a lot of how many, if not most, Americans felt about the opposite sex. They pitted men and women against each other, almost as these like warring teams with different and contradictory interests, who needed to plot and plan and manipulate each other to trick each other into forming relationships and getting married and having sex. Like, aren't those things supposed to be nice? Aren't you supposed to enjoy them and, maybe want to do them with the right people?
Yeah, that was also the premise of all of the, pickup artist stuff, like the game and all that. That was really popular for a while in the aughts, this idea that men needed to, put on airs and trick women into
in this like very weird way. Like the whole pickup artist thing was almost like The Rules, but for men in fedoras.
and those kinds of attitudes, they prevent men and women from being happy and from having relationships that are based on who people actually are as individuals and the individuals that they're interacting with, instead of just this idea about men or women. They prevent them from having, I think, happy friendships too with people of the opposite sex. And it's really sad. Luckily, as a society though, we do seem to be moving away from those types of gender games. And I think that's obviously a good thing.
Yeah, I think you're really right about that. We have moved a lot away. I've actually been watching Sex and the City lately, which is a show that was hugely popular when I was a young teen. And I hated this show when it was first on the air because it seemed like such a caricature to me. It was just like women and men, they aren't really like that, right? But I wanted to go back and watch it because, it shaped a lot of pop culture. And going back and watching now, it's a lot of those attitudes that they're just saying there that are mainstream views at the time. Those are shocking. It's all this stuff about men and women, like men and women have to play games, that men can't respect a woman who makes more money than them, that if a woman wants to get married, she has to be a renter. She can't own a property. She can't buy her own property and still expect to be married, because no man would want to marry her because that throws off the balance of power or something like that, right? And I think recognizing how much those views have changed in really not that long of a time, that's actually made it a lot more fun to watch for me. I still don't love the show, but like it's actually really interesting. And the same is true with Friends, which is a show that I actually really did enjoy growing up, but which I'm honestly really perplexed is somehow popular with Zoomers now, because a lot of the jokes in Friends are just like beyond the pale of things that we don't say and are not okay to say anymore today, right? Like, there's all these jokes about like this nanny that Rachel hires for her baby because he's a man, or Chandler like really passionately hates his parent who is trans just because they're trans, and it's a joke. And that was actually like a really common joke in a lot of 90s shows too. But like those shows, Friends, Sex and the City, those were seen as really cutting edge and super progressive at the time, right? Like, before Friends, you really hadn't seen too many character arcs in mainstream television that were really just about males and females who could be friends, no romance implied.
that's so first, hate Sex in the City, hate it for exactly the same reasons you said. The first time I watched it, I was like, why are people watching this? Like, it makes women look bad, it makes men look bad, it just makes everyone look bad. In terms of Friends, I think it's interesting because it's sort of like an edge case. A lot of the things that you're talking about, like the Ross's, sort of troglodyte attitudes, or Chandler's relationship with his father. I mean, they're played for laughs, but they're also not necessarily the good guys in this too. Like, Ross actually gets a lot of shit for his attitudes, and Chandler, there's actually like towards the, I know in the beginning, but then towards the end, there's something where he actually sort of like grapples with his relationship with his father and how maybe he's been the one being shitty. So I think that it's interesting because you saw a lot of this where they weren't necessarily condoning these attitudes, but they weren't necessarily, but they were still using them and playing them for laughs. It was sort of, you can see that we're on the verge of sort of shifting cultural attitudes towards a lot of things related to gender and sexuality.
Friends was on the air for a really long time, and you can basically, like, as you watch the whole show, watch how much society is changing so quickly. Like, the show starts out with Ross's whole masculinity being questioned because his wife has left him to marry another woman, and which is just like, oh, well, if your wife leaves you for a woman, clearly you're not really a man type thing. And then, like, by the end of the show, it's just like, yes, lesbians exist and get married. This is just normal, right?
Yeah, it is really crazy too, that the idea that men and women could just be friends, and just be like a group of friends that contain men and women, and not, all hell didn't break loose, but was like an idea that people actually thought was something novel. It does show us how far we've come. And again, like, that's one of those things that comes from these stereotypes that we're talking about, this idea that men and women are so different is actually, one of the things the feminists are trying to get rid of. I think that kind of, is the bottom line we're trying to get at here today, which is, we don't need men to approve of feminism. We're not doing this video because we're like begging men to like us. But we're discussing this because the man hater stereotype really does hurt the cause of equality.
Right. And that is what it is about, right? Like, feminism is about equality. Feminism, yes, is about women. It's about women's equality, but it's really about everyone's equality. And the ideas, the attitudes, the norms, the policies that feminists, especially libertarian feminists like us, are addressing are attitudes that hurt everybody of all genders.
So that's one of the things that we are discussing a lot of in myriad different forms in this video series, which, if you like, you should subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, share this with your friends.
Put in the comments, like, which Sex in the City character you are.
No, don't do that. We do not care which Sex in the City character you are.
I would like to be none of them. Thank you. But subscribe to this video, like and share, and tell us what you think.
Thank you.